Hey guys, tonight we tumble straight into London's East End, 1888. A door slams. Not politely, not with purpose. It's frantic, slammed shut like it's trying to keep something out, or something in. Footsteps scatter across cobblestone. Lanterns flicker in greasy windows, shadows curling in gaslight. You feel it in your chest before you understand it. Something awful has just happened. Something no one's ready to see. A shape darts through the alley. The city holds its breath. There's a woman lying still in Buck's Row. Her throat's been cut? That's all you know for now. Her name is Mary Ann Nichols, and tonight, she becomes the first in a mystery that's still unsolved. The kind that keeps detectives, dreamers, and conspiracy theorists up way past their bedtime. If you're enjoying the vibe, a like and sub would mean a lot. It's free, and you can always unsubscribe if your tastes change. Also, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is. Drop it in the comments. Hope you're doing okay out there. All right, get comfy. Let's ease deeper into the fog. It's a Thursday night in Whitechapel. The summer's hanging on, but only barely. The kind of night where the air smells like coal and sweat, and everything's a little too quiet. The East End isn't just poor, it's pressured. 10 people to a room, gin shops on every corner, and hunger licking at everyone's ribs. It's the kind of place where no one sees you until you're dead. Mary Ann Nichols, Polly they call her, is 42. She's wearing a bonnet, a wool skirt, and 5 layers of petticoats, even though it's warm. She's been drinking. She has nowhere to sleep. That night she tells a friend, "I'll soon get my DOS money." That's the price of a bed. She turns up dead less than an hour later. And here's the thing. This kind of violence wasn't unheard of in Victorian London. The city's shadowy corners were full of danger. But what made this different was the method, the calm, the cruelty. Her throat was cut twice, cleanly. Her body laid out neatly. Her skirt lifted, but she hadn't been touched that way. It was violence with patience. Not a drunken fight, not a jealous rage, something deliberate. Now we shift to the man who finds her. It's around 3:40 a.m., and Charles Cross, a carman heading to work, stumbles upon what he first thinks is a bundle of rags. A moment later, he's calling over another man, Robert Paul. They don't know whether she's alive or dead, but they decide not to get involved too much. Ah, Victorian community spirit. They go find a constable instead. When police arrive, they see the throat slashes and the blood pooling under her shoulders. The body's still warm. But by the time a doctor gets there, she's already gone. No scream, no witnesses. And in the silence of Buck's Row, the fog closes back in. This is the start, the official start. But historians still argue whether Polly Nichols was really the first. Some believe Martha Tabram, murdered a few weeks earlier, fits the same pattern. She was stabbed 39 times, though, not cut like Polly. Too messy, they say, too impulsive. So Martha becomes the Ripper's maybe victim. A prelude, or a completely different story. Back to Polly. The police start poking around, but gently. There's no central crime lab, no fingerprinting, no real way to preserve a scene. The area's already been walked through by neighbors, gawkers, and probably a few cats. Evidence, if there was any, has already caught a cab and left town. They question the usual suspects. Drunks, husbands, nearby workers, but there's nothing concrete. No one heard anything. Which, in retrospect, might be the most chilling thing of all. Someone did something horrible right beneath people's noses. Anne slipped away. And here's where it starts to snowball. Because as grim as Polly's death was, the city doesn't really panic yet. Not until it happens again. A week passes, then 2, People keep drinking, keep struggling, keep surviving. But then it happens again. Annie Chapman is found in a backyard off Hanbury Street. Her throat's been cut too, but worse. Much worse. Her abdomen's been opened. Organs are missing. Now it's real. This isn't just violence. This is surgical, intentional, and maybe ritualistic. It's around this time that newspapers start sniffing out something bigger. Headlines get bolder. Terms like monster and fiend begin appearing. The name Leather Apron is thrown around, a local menace who shakes down streetwalkers for money. He becomes a boogeyman, a name with no face. Except here's your quirky tidbit for the night. There really was a guy called John Pizer, nicknamed Leather Apron, a bootmaker. But he had alibis for the killings and was released. Still, the nickname stuck because it felt right, like calling the boogeyman Freddy Gloveman. Something in the name scratches the brain. The public doesn't care about Pizer's innocence. What they care about is that someone out there is killing women and not getting caught. And maybe worse, he's choosing who dies. Not just at random. No rich ladies, no shopkeepers. Only women who live on the edge of existence. Women no one protects. You might be wondering where Jack got his name. That's coming soon, but not quite yet. Meanwhile, investigators are fumbling. They divide the case across multiple precincts. Everyone wants a piece, but no one wants to share. Files are lost. Witnesses vanish. Leads tangle up like bad fishing wire. Back in Hanbury Street, Annie's body is barely covered before gawkers start poking around. One local journalist even sketches the scene before the body is moved. You didn't mishear. He draws it, as if it's a still life in art class. Welcome to Victorian media. And here's your mainstream historical fact. At this point, London has more than 6,000 police officers for 5 million people. That's not bad for the time. But they're mostly focused on keeping order, not solving mysteries. Detectives were still a novelty. Holmesian logic was popular in fiction, but real life was more shruggy. So what do you have? A second woman dead, a city on edge, and an unseen killer who's just getting started. There's a smell of revolution in the air. Not the good kind, but the kind where people don't trust anyone anymore. Not their neighbors, not their constables, not even their own eyes. And in the middle of all this, somewhere in the fog, a man is walking calmly through the night. Hands clean, boots quiet, no rush, because he knows he's invisible. The fog doesn't lift. Not in Whitechapel. Not really. It just settles into the brick and bone of the place, curling through alleys, soaking into shawls, and hanging like suspicion over every doorway. If you're out walking at night in the autumn of 1888, your footsteps echo, no matter how soft your shoes, and every shadow starts to feel like it's watching back. And now people are watching each other too. Because Annie Chapman's murder isn't just brutal, it's public. She's found just a few feet from a neighbor's back door, behind 29 Hanbury Street. The killer could have been seen by anyone, but he wasn't. Not even by the man who claimed to have passed Annie, chatting with someone who looked shabby genteel. That's Victorian for kinda sketchy but polite. He didn't hear screams, didn't notice blood. He just walked on. When the sun comes up, Whitechapel does not. It's already awake, buzzing with whispers, stiff with fear. 2 women now. 2 throats set-lit. 2 mutilated bodies. The news spreads before the blood dries. And here's where the panic really kicks in. The papers grab the story and wring every drop of horror out of it. Headlines scream murder. Cartoons show the East End as a dark carnival of violence. And suddenly, polite society, the part of London that usually avoids Whitechapel like a bad smell starts paying attention. But it's not the good kind of attention. Middle-class readers shake their heads. Why are these women even walking the streets at night, they ask, safe behind teacups? There's pity, sure, but it comes pre-packaged with judgment. The victims are described less as people and more as types. Fallen women, casuals, drunks, disposable. Yet the murders are too terrible to ignore. So, in a strange twist, the city starts to fixate, not on the victims, but on the killer. Who could do this? Why? What kind of person slinks through crowded streets, commits murder in near silence, and disappears before the blood goes cold? You can practically hear the detective novels flying off the shelves. But in real life, the investigation is floundering. No clear witness, no clear motive. And the press, they are no help. If anything, they are feeding the fire. Because something new is happening. The story is becoming entertainment. Your quirky tidbit for tonight. People start forming murder tours only weeks after Annie Chapman is killed. Groups walk through the crime scenes, pointing at bloodstains and trying to guess the killer's route. One vendor even sells Ripper knives as souvenirs, short blades with red-painted tips. It's gruesome, but business is booming. Meanwhile, Scotland Yard is under siege. Journalists call the detectives incompetent. Politicians use the murders to bash police budgets, and ordinary citizens. They're afraid, sure, but they're also getting angry. Because the city has rules. There are guards, there are gas lamps, there are men with truncheons. This kind of thing isn't supposed to happen here. It feels medieval, like someone slipped through time and brought an old monster into the modern world. And now, London wants a name. It gets one soon. A letter arrives at the Central News Agency, postmarked late September. The handwriting is smooth, the tone smug. The signature? Jack the Ripper. It's the first time anyone uses that name, and no one forgets it. There had been letters before, plenty, dozens of cranks and copycats writing in, pretending to be the killer. But this one is different. It's chilling, taunting, and worse, it's clever. You'll hear me again, he writes. I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. It's the kind of letter that makes your skin crawl and your imagination run wild. Now, historians still argue whether this letter was real. Some say it came from a journalist trying to spice up the headlines. Others think it might be legit. But regardless of who wrote it, the effect is immediate. The killer now has a brand. And it's a good one. Jack the Ripper sounds sharp, mean, mythical, like a ghost with a knife. It sticks in the public imagination like a hook. The story grows teeth. Back in Whitechapel, the fear deepens. Women stop going out at night. Locals form informal patrols. Men wear badges saying, Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. They carry sticks, sometimes torches. One man even brings a revolver, which, considering the state of aim in 1888, is more of a threat to neighbors than any killer. Still, the city simmers. And then it boils. End of September. 2 more women. One night. Elizabeth Stride is the first. She's found just before 1 a.m. in Dutfield's yard. Throat cut. But this time, no mutilation, no time maybe, because someone might have interrupted him. Witnesses heard a scuffle. One man even saw someone standing over her body in the dark. He steps closer. The man walks off. Just like that. Half an hour later, Catherine Eddowes is found in Mitre Square. And this one is bad. Not just a slit throat, not just organs taken, but the face? It's been slashed, deeply, deliberately, as if to erase her. It's the most violent yet. And now, the public's imagination jumps the tracks. This isn't just murder, they think. This is hate, ritual, madness. Back in the streets, chalk marks appear on brick walls. The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. It's found near the murder scene, just above a bloodied apron believed to be the killer's. Police erase it before dawn. Why? Because tensions are already sky high, and that graffiti is dangerously close to inciting a riot. Anti-Semitism was already bubbling beneath the surface, and now Jewish residents are being blamed. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Whitechapel had a large and growing immigrant population in 1888, particularly Eastern European Jews fleeing persecution. Their arrival created friction, jobs, housing, culture. The Ripper murders lit a match in an already dry field. And here comes the second wave of scapegoats. Anyone foreign, anyone weird, anyone walking alone. But no one's caught. That's the maddening part. Every time it's the same. The body is found, the blood is still warm, and the killer is long gone. No footprints, no stray hairs, just silence. Scotland Yard throws every resource it has at the case. Detectives go undercover. Hundreds of men are questioned, houses searched, horses interviewed. Okay, not that last one, but you get the idea. Still, nothing. At this point, the public is convinced of two things. 1, the police are useless. 2, the killer is brilliant. Historians today aren't so sure. About the second part, anyway. Some believe Jack wasn't a genius, just lucky that the darkness, chaos, and sheer noise of Whitechapel gave him cover, that his success was less about brilliance and more about timing. Still, it's hard to shake the feeling. Someone is out there sharpening a knife, humming a tune, and walking calmly through fog while the rest of the city screams. You're walking through Whitechapel in the daylight now, but it doesn't help. The streets still feel narrow and watchful, like they're keeping secrets under their cobblestones. Life continues, because it has to, but there's a stiffness to it now. People glance over their shoulders more. They cross streets sooner, and when they speak, it's softer, as if the fog might be listening. But if you really want to understand why the Ripper wasn't caught, you have to understand who he was targeting, not just as victims, but as people the city barely acknowledged. Tonight, you're going to follow one of them. Her name is Catherine Eddowes. You've met her already, in Mitre Square, but rewind a day. Step into her shoes. She's 56. She's funny. She's smart. Her smile still has spark, but her life is a tangle. Poverty, alcohol, bad luck, and long nights without a bed. The kind of life that slips through cracks faster than a copper can shout, "Oi!" Catherine doesn't always live on the street. She has a partner. Sometimes they scrape together enough for a doss house. But on the night she dies, she's been drinking, picked up by police, and sleeps it off in a cell. When they release her just past 1 a.m., she thanks them, walks off, and never makes it home. She's last seen alive 10 minutes before her body is found. 10 minutes. Now remember, this isn't just about the killer. It's about the world he operated in. A world where women like Catherine were seen, officially, as unfortunates. Not criminals exactly, but not quite people either. Their poverty was treated like a character flaw. Let's talk about that. Victorian London had a very clear social ladder, and at the very bottom, below chimney sweeps, below errand boys, maybe just above sewer rats, were the destitute women of the East End. Many were widows. Many had children they couldn't support. Some had disabilities, scars, or stories no one ever asked to hear. And here's your mainstream historical fact. In 1888, over 1,200 women were registered as sleeping rough in East London on any given night. That number only included those seen or counted. The real number was likely much higher. For most, the only way to get food or shelter was to exchange what they could: clothes, belongings, or, most commonly, themselves. Now the word prostitute is stamped on their death certificates. But it's important to remember what that meant at the time. It didn't always mean a full profession. Sometimes it meant one desperate decision made on one desperate night. A barter, a compromise, a hope. Take Elizabeth Stride, another Ripper victim. She sometimes cleaned rooms, sometimes helped at a coffee house, sometimes did odd jobs, but the one time she was seen offering herself on the street, well, that's what defined her afterward. Now imagine being hunted in that world. Imagine knowing you could be next, not because you're famous, not because you're wealthy, but because you're invisible. Historians still argue whether the Ripper chose his victims based on opportunity or ideology. Was it just about convenience? Women easy to approach, alone at night? Or was there a grim purpose to his selection? Some believe he was enacting some twisted moral judgment. Others think he was targeting symbols of the city's failure, killing the ones society had already abandoned. But here's a quieter thought, one less theatrical. Maybe he chose them because he knew no one would look too hard. Now about those doss houses. You can smell them before you see them. A penny to sleep on a rope. 2 pennies for a seat with a wall. 4 pennies for a spot in a shared bed. 10 pennies? Luxury. A mattress, maybe even a blanket. There were hundreds of these establishments scattered across the East End. Some were managed with care, others were barely controlled chaos. Crowded, dark, and loud with drunk singing, coughing, muttering. If someone screamed in one, no one blinked. And yet, these places were safety to many, a spot to rest, a place to be left alone, unless you didn't have the pennies. That's where Polly Nichols was the night she died, wandering, trying to earn her bed money. Same for Annie, same for Catherine. Their stories echo each other, not because they were the same, but because the system boxed them into the same tragic shape. Your quirky tidbit for tonight: some doss houses used a system called rope sleeping, where for a penny, you'd be allowed to sleep sitting up, slumped forward, over a rope stretched wall to wall. In the morning, someone would cut the rope, and everyone would fall forward like Victorian dominoes. The phrase hung over may have originated from that. Not booze, but posture. Now imagine walking out of that into a cold alley, looking for your next penny, and seeing a stranger in the fog. Let's pull back again. The press begins to romanticize the Ripper. Not in a good way, but in a way that blurs the horror. Writers call him the Phantom of Whitechapel. Some even suggest he's a surgeon, a failed doctor, a mad nobleman bored with his riches. You might think, this sounds like distraction, like they're avoiding the reality of what's happening. And you'd be right. Because talking about Jack as a mysterious genius is easier than talking about why these women were left so vulnerable in the first place. Here's something weirdly telling. When one journalist wrote a detailed story about Polly Nichols, including interviews with her family, letters she'd sent, and her favorite hymns, it wasn't the headline. It wasn't even front page. Because grief, apparently, doesn't sell as well as gore. Back to the investigation. Scotland Yard starts working with sketch artists. They send plainclothes officers into the streets. Some even dress as women to try and lure the killer. But the efforts are scattered, the intelligence patchy, and when locals report suspicious figures, the descriptions vary wildly. Tall, short, foreign, native, well-dressed, ragged. One man even claims the Ripper wore a deerstalker hat, like Sherlock Holmes, which had only just become popular fiction. Modern profilers have tried to recreate the man behind the murders. Most agree. White male, mid-30s, likely lived or worked in Whitechapel, probably had some anatomical knowledge, maybe a butcher or medical student. But even now, in the age of DNA and databases, we still don't know. Because whoever Jack was, he understood the city better than the police did. He knew its blind spots, its rhythms, its silence. And he knew one more thing. The city wouldn't chase him forever. Eventually, something else would happen, some new crisis, and people would move on. But not yet. Because the autumn was still falling, and there were still bodies to find. By now, the nights in Whitechapel feel like they're being stalked. The gas lamps flicker lower. The silence in the alleyways seems more deliberate, like the buildings themselves are holding their breath. You know that feeling, don't you? The hush right before a thunderclap. That stillness before the storm hits. Except this storm keeps returning, with a knife. After Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, London is frantic. The newspapers nickname that night the double event. 2 women, 2 scenes, less than an hour apart. The sense that the killer is growing more daring, more urgent, is hard to shake. Now, if you were a regular Londoner in late September 1888, you wouldn't just be frightened. You'd be angry, furious that the police hadn't caught anyone, furious that people kept dying, furious that something invisible could keep slipping through your city like a rumor with blood on its boots. So it makes sense that when the next murder happens, it sets the whole district alight. Let's meet Mary Jane Kelly. She's different from the others in one big way. She's not killed in a public space. No alleys, no yards. This time, it's inside. Mary Jane lives at 13 Miller's Court, a cramped, damp, one-room flat off Dorset Street. Her window is broken. Her rent is overdue. She's 25, youngest of the canonical victims. And she's known for her singing voice. People call her fair and kind. Others say she was guarded. No one knew her full story. Maybe that was by design. Now, here's where things twist a little tighter. Because Mary Jane Kelly's murder is so much more brutal, so much more extreme, that even veteran police officers can't stomach the scene. A neighbor hears singing late into the night. "A violet from Mother's grave," she says. Then, silence. No screams. No struggle. The next morning, the landlord sends a collector for rent. No answer. The man peers through the broken window and freezes. Then he runs. Because what he saw, that becomes one of the most infamous crime scenes in British history. We won't describe it in detail. Not here. Not like that. But it's enough to say that Mary Jane's body was mutilated beyond recognition. Every inch of the room, walls, floor, furniture, was marked. The killer had time, privacy, and something in him that wanted to destroy, not just kill. This wasn't about death anymore. This was obliteration. It leads to a strange kind of debate, because historians still argue whether Mary Jane's murder fits the Ripper's pattern, or if it was an escalation beyond him. Some say it was a different man, or a copycat, or the same man, finally unmasked by the madness inside him. No one agrees, and maybe no one ever will. Here's your quirky tidbit. For years afterward, the room Mary Jane died in was locked and never rented again. Eventually, the entire building was torn down. But before that, local children dared each other to touch the door, as if it might still burn with something dark. Now, let's talk police again. Because this time, they're sure they'll catch him. A private room means clues, right? No escape route, no random witnesses, just walls and time. But here's the problem. By the time police arrive, the room is already contaminated. Curious locals have gathered. Evidence has been shifted. And most damning of all, no one saw anyone leave. Miller's Court is a tight cluster of dwellings. You can't walk in or out without being noticed, which means either the killer blended in perfectly, or he never left. Some even wonder if Jack lived nearby, maybe right in Miller's Court. Think about it. He wouldn't look suspicious entering, wouldn't draw attention leaving, and if anyone did see him, they probably saw him all the time. That kind of invisibility is terrifying. Your mainstream historical fact: Dorset Street, where Mary Jane lived, was nicknamed the worst street in London. Crime, poverty, violence. It was infamous even before the murders. And afterward, it became a permanent scar on the city's psyche. After Mary Jane Kelly, everything changes. The fear peaks, the police presence surges, and then, nothing. No more victims. Not officially, at least. That's another puzzle. Why did he stop? Was he arrested for something else? Did he die? Did he leave London? Did he change victims? Or, most unnerving of all, did he simply lose interest? Imagine a killer deciding he's done. Not because he was stopped, but because he was satisfied. That silence after Mary Jane's death is deafening. People keep looking over their shoulders. But nights go by without new screams. The fog rolls in, but nothing moves in it. And slowly, very slowly, the city begins to unclench its jaw. There are no press releases, no triumphant arrests, just a gradual, uneasy return to routine. But it's not over. Because the memory lingers, and theories begin to multiply like soot in the air. Did you know Queen Victoria herself wrote letters to her ministers urging better street lighting and more social support in the East End? She was horrified by the murders, but also by what they revealed about how her poorest subjects lived. For once, the Crown noticed Whitechapel, but it didn't last. New scandals replaced old ones. The city moved on, as cities do. Yet something stuck. The Ripper wasn't just a murderer. He was a mirror, one that showed London all the cracks in its own face. He exposed more than flesh. He exposed failure. Failure to protect, failure to care, failure to see, and most of all, failure to stop him. The gas lamps are still lit, but something's changed in Whitechapel. The fear hasn't gone. It's just gone quiet, like smoke after a fire. People walk the streets again, but slower. Every sharp footstep still gets a second glance. Every shadow, every rustle in the dark, still earns a pause. And now, something new starts to take root. Obsession. With the killer. With the mystery. With the story. Because when horror fades, curiosity fills the space. And Victorian London, bless its drama-loving heart, is starving for theories. Enter the press. Not that they ever left. But now, they go from reporting murders to sculpting mythology. This is the era of the penny dreadful. Cheap dramatic pamphlets sold for, yes, a penny. They're filled with gory tales, wild speculation, and just enough truth to feel convincing. Some turn Jack into a masked figure of revenge. Others suggest he's a vampire. Some claim he's a doctor by day and a monster by night. One even suggests he's a woman in disguise, a midwife hiding in plain sight. It sounds laughable now, but at the time, people bought it, ate it up like it was toffee on Guy Fawkes night. Here's your quirky tidbit. One popular theory claimed Jack was an escaped lunatic from a private asylum, aided by corrupt staff who helped cover his tracks. It had zero proof, but it sold thousands of copies. The more the story spread, the more story it became. Facts blurred. Witnesses changed their accounts. And the press, well, the press couldn't get enough. You had headlines like "Ghastly Murder and Fiend in Human Form" in bold, shrieking fonts. Illustrated crime scenes. Eyewitnesses who definitely weren't there. An old woman saw a man with a shiny bag and wild eyes. One article reads, "It later turned out to be a traveling dentist." And yet, every article added to the mythos. The Ripper wasn't just a man anymore. He was a character. Mysterious, malevolent, smarter than the police, one step ahead. The kind of criminal that makes readers lean closer, not run away. Historians still argue whether the press helped the investigation by spreading awareness or hurt it by glamorizing terror. Most lean toward the latter. Because something dangerous happened when Jack got famous. Real people became footnotes. Mary Ann, Annie, Elizabeth, Catherine, Mary Jane. Their names faded behind the monster's shadow. Let's pause on that for a moment. These were real women. Poor, yes. Struggling, yes. But real. With families. With habits. With voices. We know Catherine liked singing. We know Mary Ann had 5 children she rarely saw. We know Annie wore a fake wedding ring, even though her marriage was long over. Maybe just to feel a little safer. But in the papers, they became props. Another unfortunate slain. The headlines read, "No backstory, no kindness, just body counts." It's one of the most bitter ironies in the case. The man who murdered these women gave them more attention in death than they ever received in life. Now, let's talk about how that attention turned into industry. Because even back then, people started cashing in. Writers sold QuickBooks about the case. One pamphlet claimed to be written by Jack himself, published under the title, "I Done It." Spoiler, he didn't. The owner of a nearby pub rebranded it as the Ripper's Rest and served drinks to gawkers. Some shops sold Ripper cigars. One genius even sold Ripper-themed gloves. Yes, fashion gloves, to commemorate a killer. Victorian capitalism was nothing if not enthusiastic. And the police? They were drowning. Public pressure surged. People wrote letters demanding action. Parliament debated funding. A few politicians even used the case as leverage to attack their rivals. Your mainstream historical fact: the official investigation produced over 2,000 letters, interviewed over 300 suspects, and filed more than 1,000 pages of reports. But not a single arrest was made with enough evidence to stick. This wasn't for lack of trying. But think of the tools they didn't have. No DNA, no CCTV, no reliable fingerprinting, no criminal databases. The only real resource they had was eyewitness memory, which, as we now know, is about as sturdy as a tissue in the rain. Worse, Scotland Yard was divided. Literally. The Metropolitan Police handled part of the investigation. But the murder of Catherine Eddowes occurred in Mitre Square, inside the jurisdiction of the City of London Police. Different team, different priorities, different paperwork. And these two departments, they didn't play nice. Information wasn't shared freely. Leads were hoarded. At one point, the Met and the City Police each had their own separate suspect lists, which weren't even compared until much later. It's like having two chefs trying to bake a cake without agreeing on the recipe. One adds flour, the other adds gravy. You get a mess. This split investigation is a big reason why Jack was never caught. Imagine you're chasing a ghost, but you're only allowed to see half the map. Now throw in public pressure, media lies, political games, and a suspect list that included everyone from butchers to bishops, and you've got a recipe for chaos. There was even a man named Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor, who was arrested for unrelated charges, but fled the country right after. He'd collected human organs, had a hatred for women, and wore a fabulous cape. Sounds like the guy, right? Maybe, but the evidence wasn't solid, and no one chased him hard enough to be sure. We'll get to suspects later. For now, it's enough to know they had names, just no proof. And proof was tricky, because Jack didn't leave much behind. No personal items, no bloody clothing found, no murder weapon recovered, no fingerprints. Not that they'd help yet. Just victims, letters, and fog. Lots of fog. So what do people do when logic fails? They guess. That's what the press did, what the public did, what some police even resorted to. Jack the Ripper became not just a killer, but a canvas. People projected fears onto him. Fears of immigrants, of madmen, of women gaining power, of science gone wrong. He became a symbol of everything people didn't understand or trust. And once that happened, once he stopped being real, he became untouchable. Because you can't arrest a myth. A chill hangs heavier now, not just in the night air, but in the tone of things. You can feel it. The fear has calcified into something colder, suspicion. Whitechapel isn't just watching for a killer anymore. It's watching itself. Every footstep sounds a little too deliberate. Every glance lingers a little too long. The city is turning inward, one sideways look at a time. And right when the panic needs fuel, the letters begin. Not just one, dozens. Some are scrawled on cheap paper, full of blood-curdling boasts and misused grammar. Others arrive in envelopes smeared with what looks like blood, all signed with that chilling new signature, Jack the Ripper. But one in particular stands out. It arrives at the Central News Agency, postmarked September 27, 1888. In it, the writer claims responsibility for the murders. He mocks the police, and with almost theatrical flair he writes, "I am down on whores, and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled." Yikes. It ends, of course, with, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." It's the first time that name appears in any public record, and it sticks. The newspapers run with it. The killer is no longer the Whitechapel murderer or Leather Apron. He's Jack now. And something in that name, simple, sharp, sinister, lodges itself into the public's brain like a splinter. Now, historians still argue whether the Dear Boss letter is real. Some suggest it was written by a journalist, possibly to keep the public engaged and papers flying off the shelves. The tone is a little too theatrical, the phrasing a bit too clever. But here's where things get weirder. A few days later, another letter arrives. This time, it's not a letter. It's a postcard. Same handwriting, same taunting voice. It refers to the recent double event, which the public has just learned about. So either the writer's been reading the headlines very closely, or he knows something. The postcard signs off with a snarl. I am not down on coppers, as they would like to think. Okay, still sounds like a cheeky journalist. But then comes the clincher. On October 16th, a package arrives addressed to George Lusk, head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. Inside, a letter and half a human kidney. The letter reads, "Oh, from hell, Mr. Lusk. Sore I send you half the kidney I took from one woman. Preserved it for you. The other piece I fried and ate it. It was very nice." Gruesome? Extremely. Spell-checked? Not at all. The kidney part is real. The doctors examine it. It's human. It's a left kidney, the same organ missing from Catherine Eddowes. Could it be hers? Maybe. Maybe not. The medical science of the time couldn't make a conclusive match, and even today the trail's too cold to confirm it. Still, the coincidence is chilling, and the tone of the "from hell" letter feels different. Less theatrical, more primal, more real. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some modern researchers believe the "from hell" letter may be the only authentic Ripper letter, not because of the kidney, but because it lacks the polished wordplay of the others. It feels less like a performance, more like a glimpse into a disturbed mind. But even if all these letters were fakes, they still mattered, because they shifted the narrative. Jack wasn't just a killer now. He was a pen pal of death. He could reach anyone, anywhere. Your letterbox wasn't safe, and neither were your kidneys. Suddenly, the murders weren't just about bodies in alleys. They were about psychological invasion. The idea that the killer could be in your neighborhood, then on your desk. And the press? Oh, they ran wild. They printed the letters in full. They speculated about the handwriting. Some papers hired their own graphologists to guess the author's age, background, even hat size. Every grocery clerk with messy cursive became a suspect. Which brings us to the copycats. With all this attention, other murderers, yes, others, began imitating Jack. Some crimes mimicked the mutilations. Others wrote their own Ripper letters. One particularly gruesome murder involved carving initials into the victim's face. But here's the catch. The real Jack, if he was still alive, never signed off again. No letter after From Hell has gained even a shred of credibility. And that's where the scholars start throwing punches. Historians still argue whether Jack sent any letters at all. Some think every single one, including From Hell, was a fake, a hoax, designed to terrify the public or sell more newspapers. Others believe that Jack used the letters to manipulate the investigation, to taunt, to control the narrative. Some modern profilers suggest that the killer might have been more interested in infamy than escape. But the police, they're floundering. They release the Dear Boss letter to the public, hoping someone will recognize the handwriting. Over 100 people come forward claiming to know the author. None pan out. They trace the postmarks. Useless. Victorian mail didn't use return addresses, and post offices were so chaotic, you could have mailed a goat with a feather duster and no one would have blinked. Eventually, the letters stop arriving. And like the murders, the silence is somehow louder than the noise. Now, let's zoom out. What do the letters tell us, if anything? They tell us that fear was no longer just physical. It was psychological, intimate. Jack had entered people's homes, not through a window, but through words. He didn't need to kill someone to make them afraid anymore. And that's power. Dark, awful power, but power all the same. Your mainstream historical fact. By November 1888, the police had cataloged over 600 letters claiming to be from Jack the Ripper. Some were poetic, some threatening, some just bizarre. One was a 10-page essay on vegetarianism signed, "The Real Ripper, I Swear." Jack became less a man and more an open-source monster. Anyone could be him. Anyone could write like him. Anyone could use his name to cause panic. And that's maybe the most unsettling twist of all. Because when terror wears a name tag, and that name becomes popular, it never really goes away. You hear the boots before you see the men. Heavy, polished, deliberate. Not marching, patrolling, swinging lanterns through thick fog, truncheons at their hips. Helmets pulled low. It's late October now, and the Metropolitan Police are out in force. But if you asked any of them quietly, they'd probably admit they're not hunting Jack anymore. They're just trying to keep the peace. Because this isn't a whodunit with a clear path. It's a storm of clues, theories, and dead ends. And the deeper you go into the Ripper investigation, the more tangled it becomes. So tonight, let's follow the ones trying to solve it. Let's talk about the police. Picture this. Two main forces operating side by side, but barely speaking. On one side, Scotland Yard, the Metropolitan Police, handling most of the East End. On the other, the City of London Police, a smaller but older force, covering a tight cluster of streets, including Mitre Square, where Catherine Eddowes was killed. Two forces, two investigations, two very different methods. And they don't get along. Your mainstream historical fact. At the time of the murders, the Met Police were led by Sir Charles Warren, a man with a military background who liked order, discipline, and a good map. His counterpart in the city force was James Fraser, quieter, more methodical, and slightly less interested in chasing newspaper headlines. But Warren? He hated bad press, and Jack was generating plenty. After the double event, the pressure on Warren explodes. Newspapers blame him directly. Cartoons show him blindfolded. Politicians demand his resignation. And then, there's the chalk. Remember that blood-stained apron found near Goulston Street? Above it, someone had scrawled in chalk, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Strange grammar, stranger spelling, but unmistakably anti-Semitic. When police arrive, they realize they've got a problem. The city cops want to photograph the message, document it. But Warren? He has it scrubbed off before sunrise. Why? Because crowds are forming. Anti-Semitic riots are already close to boiling. Warren's afraid the writing on the wall, literally, will incite violence. It's a decision that haunts the investigation. That message could have been evidence, could have been the Ripper's own hand, but now, gone. Erased, like fog before dawn. Historians still argue whether it was the right call. Was Warren protecting lives or erasing a vital clue? Either way, the case suffers, and so does he. Warren resigns a few weeks later, officially over disagreements with the Home Secretary. Unofficially, he's sick of being the fall guy. Now let's talk how they were investigating. Spoiler, not well. The Met didn't have forensics, databases, or even decent lighting in many areas. They used notebooks, gut feelings, witness sketches, and a whole lot of shoe leather. After each murder, they'd ask the usual questions. Did anyone see anything? Did anyone hear a scream? Did anyone notice a man leaving? Problem was, most of the time, the answer was no. And when they did get sightings, they were all over the place. One woman saw a man in a peaked cap. Another described a man with a mustache and foreign accent. A third swore she saw a well-dressed gentleman with blood on his cuffs, but no one followed up. Witnesses didn't agree. Descriptions shifted, and most people were too scared or too tired of the chaos to get involved. Your quirky tidbit: one of the main witnesses in the Mary Jane Kelly case was her cat. Well, not literally, but her neighbors reported her singing with her cat just hours before the murder. The cat stopped meowing. That's all anyone noticed. Not footsteps, not voices, just a cat going silent. Let that sink in. The investigation did try new things. For example, police began using undercover officers dressed as women to roam the streets at night. In theory, it was brilliant. In practice, well, Victorian detectives weren't exactly known for subtlety. Some wore visible uniforms under their dresses. One tripped over his hem and fell into a ditch. Another was arrested for loitering with intent by a cop who didn't realize he was part of the same team. Good intentions, bad execution. The police also brought in early criminal profilers, or what passed for them. Men who studied skull shapes and facial features. They tried to create a psychological sketch of Jack based on wounds, weapon style, and victim choice. The results? Mixed. One profiler claimed Jack was probably a left-handed barber with syphilis and mommy issues. Another suggested he was a mild-mannered clerk who carried the organs home in a briefcase. That briefcase, by the way? Pure fiction, but it appeared in multiple newspaper illustrations. The lines between fact, theory, and Victorian nonsense were already blurring. Scotland Yard even consulted mad doctors, early psychologists who studied criminal insanity. Some believed Jack was schizophrenic. Others said he was possessed. One insisted the murders had astrological significance based on the position of Mars. It was the Wild West of forensics. And while all this was happening, Londoners grew restless. Not just scared, angry, tired of inaction, tired of bodies in the street, tired of the authorities fumbling the bag. So they took matters into their own hands. Enter the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, a group of local tradesmen who patrolled the streets with sticks, lanterns, and the kind of righteous energy that comes from a good dose of fury and gin. They offered a reward for the killer, since the government refused to. They held community meetings. They posted flyers. Some even began to question whether the police were hiding something. And to be fair, they weren't wrong to wonder. Because internal memos were going missing. Some files were never shared between departments. Suspects were dismissed without full explanation. One constable's detailed notes were accidentally destroyed by fire. It didn't look like conspiracy. It looked like chaos. Which honestly is worse. Because while a cover-up suggests someone is in control, chaos means no one is. And in that chaos, Jack thrived. He didn't need invisibility. The system gave it to him. Between the split jurisdictions, poor lighting, lack of forensics, and endless guesswork, he might as well have worn a crown and danced down Whitechapel Road. It's hard to say how close the police came. Some think they interviewed him and let him go. Others believe they had no idea who he was, not even a name. But in every official document, every transcript, every fading ink line of 1888, one word is written over and over again: unsolved. Picture this. You're a Victorian detective in a wool coat 3 sizes too heavy, wading through muddy London streets with a notebook in one hand and a theory in the other. And not just your theory, everyone's theory. Because suddenly, the question isn't what happened, it's who did it. And more to the point, what kind of man could do such things? Welcome to the era of profiles and smoke. The art of criminal profiling wasn't quite a science yet. It was closer to spiritual guessing with a mustache. But that didn't stop experts from having very confident opinions about what Jack the Ripper must have been like. Let's take a little tour of the theories. Some said he was a doctor, that he must have had anatomical knowledge. After all, he removed organs quickly. And in near darkness, surgeons at the time agreed. Whoever did this knew what to look for. Others disagreed. Too messy, they said. Too fast. One doctor remarked that the kidney removal looked like it had been done with a blunt butcher's knife in the dark. Not surgical, just opportunistic. So a butcher then? That made sense too. There were plenty in Whitechapel. Easy access to knives. Easy to explain bloodstains. But again, too many suspects. One constable said, "If we arrest every butcher in the East End, we'd starve the city." Then came the more colorful ideas. A mad aristocrat, a deranged painter, a foreign sailor passing through port. Each theory had its fans, and each was helped along by that favorite Victorian pastime, phrenology. Ah yes, phrenology. The science of reading personality through the bumps on your skull. According to the experts, Jack was likely to have a protruding forehead, narrow eyes, and a sloping brow. One newspaper even published a sketch of what the Ripper probably looked like, based entirely on this bump-based guesswork. He resembled a very tired owl in a waistcoat. Your quirky tidbit. Phrenologists believed that the area of the brain responsible for destructiveness was just above the ears, so they advised people to check there when hiring servants. Yes, ear bumps were part of hiring practices. Now, as silly as some of this sounds today, these theories shaped real policy. Police were told to look for lone men with strange features. Officers stopped people for walking too slowly, for looking anxious, for talking to themselves, which in London was at least half the population. They also circulated criminal-type posters. These were less wanted posters, more artists' impressions of what evil should look like. Imagine every shady uncle you've ever avoided at a wedding, all rolled into one stern drawing. But amidst all this, a few voices offered something new: early psychology. Instead of measuring skulls, they looked at behavior, at patterns, at motive. One investigator, Dr. Thomas Bond, wrote what's considered the first criminal profile in British history. His conclusion? Jack was likely a paranoid schizophrenic, driven by sexual mania and homicidal impulses. He added that the killer probably lived alone, was quiet, kept to himself, and looked completely ordinary, which terrified everyone more than anything. Because up until then, people were hoping Jack would be easy to spot. Wild eyes, shifty behavior, a bloody apron. But if Bond was right, Jack could be anyone. A man you passed on your way to work, the guy who sharpened your razor, your brother's quiet friend with the limp handshake. Historians still argue whether Bond's profile was accurate or just Victorian guesswork with a medical license, but it marked a shift. A move away from superstition and toward analysis. And it wasn't just experts doing the analyzing. The public had opinions. Letters poured into newspapers suggesting suspects. One woman insisted Jack was a barber who'd given her a very aggressive haircut. Another claimed she recognized the handwriting from a former lover, who also hated pickles for some reason. There was no link. She just thought it was relevant. A few people claimed to be Jack himself. One man confessed, then promptly forgot the details of the murders. Another wrote poems about his own guilt and mailed them in with sprigs of lavender. And somewhere in all this noise, the real Jack stayed silent. Which brings us back to the idea of invisibility. Because it's very likely the killer walked among the very people looking for him. He may have stood in the crowd at Mary Jane Kelly's funeral. He may have watched the constables patrol from a window. He may have dropped his own letters into the postbox with a smile. And yet, no one saw him. Or if they did, they didn't understand what they were seeing. There's a terrifying theory among modern criminal psychologists that the most successful killers are the flamboyant monsters. They're the calmest men in the room. The ones who nod, agree, keep their heads down. And maybe that's what Jack was. Not a madman frothing at the mouth, but a man who knew how to blend. Let's wrap with your mainstream historical fact. In 1888, the concept of serial killing didn't exist yet. The term serial killer wasn't coined until 1980. At the time, the idea that one person would kill multiple strangers, methodically and over time, just didn't register as a pattern. Authorities treated each murder as a separate crime, not as part of a chain. That, more than anything, might be why Jack got away. Because the system wasn't built to see him. And by the time it started to learn how, he was already gone. The fog rolls back in, not a gentle mist, but a thick, muffling wall. And somewhere inside it, under a weak gas lamp and the weight of too many failures, a city braces itself. Because now, we're in October 1888, and the fear in Whitechapel isn't speculative anymore. It's earned. The Ripper's rhythm had been vicious, but strangely consistent. Then came silence. For days. For weeks. And just when people start to exhale, he returns. Let's walk into the autumn of Terror's Peak. It's the night of September 30th, just before 1 a.m., when Elizabeth Stride is found in Dutfield's yard. Her throat is cut, but that's it. No mutilation, no disfigurement, just one deep, clean slice. Police think he was interrupted. Someone may have spooked him. The killer fled before he could finish what he started. That theory becomes horrifyingly convincing 45 minutes later. Because a second body turns up. This time it's Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square. Not just killed, unmade. Her throat is slashed, her abdomen torn, a kidney missing. Her face disfigured, one cheek flayed, one eyelid sliced, one ear nicked. This is rage with precision. It's the most brutal yet. And it's the only one committed within the City of London Police's jurisdiction. Which means 2 murders, 2 locations, 2 different forces investigating. And Jack slipped between the seams. You can feel the dread solidify now. Not just fear for safety, but fear that this man cannot be stopped. Officers flood the streets. Lanterns swing across cobblestone. Bloodhounds are brought in. But the scent's gone. One dog gets spooked and refuses to enter a yard. That's your quirky tidbit. Victorian bloodhounds were highly prized, but notoriously finicky. One refused to follow a killer because it found a sausage cart more interesting. Another fell asleep on the job. The dogs were retired shortly after the case stalled. No offense to the canines, but they didn't help. The public, livid. The press, electrified. This double murder makes headlines across Europe. French papers call it un crime d'ombre, a crime of shadow. In Berlin, they nickname him Der Nebelmann, the Fog Man. Londoners form vigilante groups by the dozen. Men roam in trios, carrying cudgels, wearing makeshift badges. Some think Jack is a doctor. Others say he's a butcher. One guy insists he's a teacher from Wales, because of course someone had a vendetta against Welsh grammar. And still, no leads. Investigators are desperate. And then, a clue. Remember that bloodied apron found in Goulston Street? It's Catherine Eddowes's, found hours after her death, far from where her body was discovered. Above it, written in chalk, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." You've heard about it already back in Section 7, but now you're here in the moment, and it hits differently. It's 5:15 a.m. The sun isn't up yet. Officers argue over what to do. Superintendent Thomas Arnold and Commissioner Charles Warren arrive. They decide. Erase it. No photo. No copy. Because if left alone, this scrawl might incite a riot. And not a metaphorical one. An actual, screaming, brick-throwing riot. You see, tensions were already high. Many in Whitechapel blamed immigrants, particularly Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe, for the state of the neighborhood. Some believed the killer had a foreign look. Others whispered darker conspiracies. And that brings us to the wave of xenophobia and scapegoating sweeping the East End. The Ripper wasn't caught, but plenty of innocent men were dragged into suspicion, especially if they had accents, especially if they were poor, especially if they looked even slightly different. The Goulston Street graffito may have been a red herring, or a genuine clue. Historians still argue whether Jack himself wrote it, or whether it was already there and just happened to be near the apron. Either way, the message becomes symbolic, not of guilt, but of how quickly a city can turn on itself when it's afraid. In the weeks that follow, arrests are made, not of the Ripper, but of Jewish men, black men, Chinese dock workers, even Italians selling meat pies. Some were beaten by crowds before police could intervene. Your mainstream historical fact. In the fall of 1888, the British government quietly increased surveillance in Jewish neighborhoods. Not to catch Jack, but to prevent what officials called an uncontrolled public backlash. In simpler terms, they feared riots more than murder. Meanwhile, the Ripper fades again. No murders for weeks. And in that silence, London begins to implode under its own frustration. Theories begin to splinter. Some believe the killer is dead. Others think he fled the country. Still others whisper that the police know who he is, but can't arrest him. That theory is about to explode, but not yet. Let's step back into the crime scenes for a second. The two murders of the double event were different in tone. Elizabeth Stride's death felt incomplete, like the killer was rushed. Catherine Edow's, pure calculation. Her wounds were deliberate, patterned, her face marked with the kind of hatred that feels personal. Many experts believe that Catherine may have spoken to him, maybe recognized him, maybe insulted him. Something triggered the escalation. But it's just guesswork. Jack left no fingerprints, no trace, no signature beyond the violence. And after Mitre Square, he simply vanishes again, until the final, terrible return. But that's a story for Section 10. For now, picture London at 3 a.m., fog curling over rooftops, boots echoing in empty lanes. A constable checks his watch, and somewhere in a window above him, someone's awake, watching. London doesn't sleep exactly. It just dims. It simmers. And in Whitechapel, every window is a watching eye, every alley a question mark. The Ripper has gone quiet again, but no one feels safe. Silence by now is his most terrifying trick, because every quiet night feels like the coil of a spring, wound, tense, ready to snap. But something else is happening now too. Something older than terror. Something every empire knows well in the face of crisis. Blame. And this time, the blame falls hard. It starts with whispers. In pubs, in butcher shops, at doss houses. He looked foreign, someone says. I saw him. Dark coat, foreign accent. Tall fella, not one of us. And just like that, the East End's fear turns outward. Let's talk about the scapegoats. Your mainstream historical fact. In 1888, London's East End had a Jewish population of around 60,000 dollars, many of them immigrants from Eastern Europe escaping pogroms. They came looking for safety. What they got instead, thanks to Jack the Ripper, was suspicion. The Goulston Street chalk didn't help. That strange, murky phrase. The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing, whether written by the killer or not, acted like kerosene. Within days, locals started attacking Jewish businesses. Some shop windows were smashed. Others had graffiti scrawled across the brick. Murderers. Foreign devils. The usual poison. Police stationed guards outside synagogues. Some Jewish men began walking in groups to avoid being cornered. Here's your quirky tidbit. A few local Jewish tailors started wearing extra clean aprons just to avoid being mistaken for leather apron. The nickname the papers had briefly pinned on a man named John Pizer. He had an alibi, but that didn't stop the harassment. For weeks, people shouted at him in the street. "Ripper!" They'd yell. "Killer!" Never mind that he was innocent. The nickname stuck like tar. The broader public, meanwhile, wanted answers. They were tired of theories, tired of silence. They wanted a face. And the police were getting desperate to give them one. So they began hauling in suspects, not based on hard evidence, but on appearance. Foreign looking? Suspicious? Poor English? Even more suspicious. Lived alone. Clearly hiding something. Scotland Yard's suspect list exploded into the hundreds. But none of them stuck. That's when the more exotic theories started floating into the conversation. Maybe Jack wasn't just some East End maniac. Maybe he was someone powerful. And just like that, the whispers moved upward. Let's linger here for a moment, because this shift is important. When fear starts eating its own tail, it often looks for conspiracies. And in Victorian England, there was no bigger, juicier conspiracy than one that involved royalty. Enter the royal theory. It starts with a name, Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, Queen Victoria's grandson. The story, told and retold, is that Albert Victor secretly married a Catholic woman in Whitechapel. They had a child. The royal family, desperate to cover it up, sent agents to eliminate anyone who knew. And those 5 women? They were witnesses. Neat, dramatic, perfectly cinematic. Also, almost certainly nonsense. Historians still argue whether Prince Albert had ever even set foot in Whitechapel. His health was poor, his schedule well documented, but the theory refuses to die. Why? Because it's emotionally satisfying. The idea that Jack wasn't a monster from the slums, but a monster from a palace. That the very people meant to protect you were the ones doing the killing? It hit a nerve. And it still does. Now, this isn't just a Victorian quirk. This is human nature. When tragedy strikes without explanation, our minds race to fill the gaps. We'd rather believe in evil that's organized than evil that's random. And that's what makes Jack so terrifying. Because he wasn't part of a system. He wasn't a ghost, or a vampire, or a prince. He was almost certainly a man. Just a man. A man who knew the streets, who blended in, who moved like a rumor, and who, with every murder, forced the city to tear itself apart trying to find him. Your mainstream historical fact. At the height of the panic, some newspapers offered rewards for private tips, but the Metropolitan Police refused to do the same, fearing it would lead to false accusations. They were right, but also that didn't stop the mob. One night, a constable was nearly beaten by a crowd who mistook him for a suspect. He was wearing the wrong hat. That's all it took. There were even vigilante dragnets, roving groups of men stopping people in the streets, demanding explanations for where they'd been, what they were doing. One man, an elderly German baker, was nearly lynched outside his shop for lurking too quietly. And through it all, the killer stayed invisible. It's almost elegant, in a terrible way. He left chaos behind him, like a trail of breadcrumbs. But those breadcrumbs led everywhere, and nowhere. The people turned on each other. The police turned inward. And the killer? He watched. Or maybe he didn't. Maybe he fled the city. Or died. Or was institutionalized quietly, without anyone realizing they'd locked away history's greatest ghost. That, too, is part of the terror. We don't know when he stopped, or why, or if. But we do know this. After October, the murders stopped. at least the ones we're sure of. Mary Jane Kelly's murder, the worst of them all, was the final signature. The performance over. Curtain down. And as the city began to breathe again, something strange happened. They missed him. Not consciously, not in a way anyone would admit, but the streets felt emptier. The headlines, less electric. The drama was gone. And that absence, it became a vacuum, one that would be filled again and again for decades to come. With suspects, with books, with films, and with the same question over and over: who was Jack the Ripper? By now, London has shifted. The killings have stopped, or at least the canonical 5 have come to their brutal close. But the city doesn't exhale with relief. Not really. It holds the breath in its chest, just in case. Because even without fresh blood, the suspicion doesn't stop. If anything, it multiplies. Let's dive into the suspects. Because oh boy, the list doesn't just grow, it blooms. Like a poisonous Victorian rose. And not just a handful of names. Dozens. Hundreds. Some ridiculous, some convincing. All of them fed by a city that still can't sleep. Your mainstream historical fact. By 1891, Scotland Yard had investigated over 300 individuals in connection to the Ripper murders. Some were interrogated. Some were followed. A few were quietly let go, even though the public never heard about them. But let's start with one of the early fan favorites. Montague John Druitt. A barrister, a schoolteacher, no, quiet, well-educated, and dead. Found drowned in the Thames in early December 1888, just weeks after Mary Jane Kelly's murder. He left a strange note, had shown signs of mental instability, and most suspiciously, the murders stopped after his death. Some high-ranking officers were convinced he was Jack. Case closed, they whispered. No need to tell the public? Why stir the pot? Except, there's no real evidence tying him to Whitechapel. He lived miles away. No eyewitnesses, no motive. Just a convenient death and a dark hunch. Historians still argue whether Druitt was truly the man. Some say yes. Others think he was just another troubled soul in a city full of them. Now let's meet. Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-Jewish barber with known mental health issues. He lived in Whitechapel. He was institutionalized not long after the final Ripper murder. And according to some reports, he hated women, specifically sex workers. Years later, Assistant Commissioner Sir Robert Anderson wrote in his memoirs that they'd identified the killer as a low-class Polish Jew, but couldn't bring him to trial due to lack of witnesses. Most believe he meant Kosminski. Add to that some early forensic claims, disputed, yes, that DNA on a shawl found near a victim matched Kosminski's descendants. But the chain of custody on that shawl is shaky at best. It may have been contaminated over the years. Still, Kosminski remains a leading theory. He ticks a lot of boxes. But not everyone's convinced. Because then there's George Chapman, born Severin Kłosowski, a Polish immigrant barber who moved to Whitechapel in the early 1880s. He later poisoned 3 of his wives. That's right, poisoned. Not exactly the Ripper's MO, but he was violent, controlling, manipulative. He had surgical tools, and he was in the area. Police at the time even believed he might be a later version of Jack, evolving his methods. But others say, people don't go from evisceration to teacup poisoning. That's not evolution. That's something else entirely. Here's your quirky tidbit. One theory, floated in a particularly dramatic 1895 newspaper, claimed Chapman wasn't just a murderer, but a time-traveling demon. He emerged from no records, claimed no past, and wore shoes with no leather. This was disproven almost instantly by the census. But hey, Victorian journalism knew how to spice things up. Ready for a curveball? Dr. Thomas Neal Cream, a real doctor, a real poisoner, executed in 1892 for killing several women in the US and the UK. Legend has it that when he was hanged, he whispered, "I am Jack," as the noose snapped. Dramatic, too dramatic. There's one major problem. He was in prison during the Ripper murders. Unless he had an evil twin with an identical mustache, that's a no. But the legend sticks, because it's eerie. And eerie sells. Then there's the weird ones. Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor. Arrested in 1888 for gross indecency. Red? Suspected homosexual activity, which was criminal at the time. He fled back to the US shortly after being released on bail. He had a collection of female organs in jars. He hated women. He loved Victorian drama. And the kicker, he was actually investigated by the police, but never charged. Some modern ripperologists consider him a top suspect. Others think he was just creepy and loud, like your neighbor with the strange garden statues. And finally, Walter Sickert. Yes, the painter, a real one, a student of Whistler, friend of the Impressionists, obsessed with dark themes. Author Patricia Cornwell famously accused him of being the Ripper in her best-selling book, citing DNA evidence, again from questionable sources, and supposed symbolism in his paintings. Problem: Sickert was likely in France during the murders. Another problem: Cornwell destroyed one of his paintings in an attempt to collect DNA. The art world has never forgiven her. Historians still argue whether she was onto something, or just on a book tour. Now here's what's important to remember. All of these suspects? They were compelling because they filled in the gaps. Jack the Ripper, by vanishing, left a space so gaping, so infuriatingly empty, that anyone even remotely suspicious became a candidate. And because no one was ever caught, none of them can be ruled out. That's the trick. You can build a case around almost anyone if you squint hard, the troubled noble. All of them have been Jack, and none of them. Because in the vacuum he left, the city started drawing faces over shadows and calling them facts. It didn't help that police records from the time were lost, destroyed, or quietly misplaced. Some suspect accidental fires, others think deliberate cleaning. After all, a case this public, this humiliating, wouldn't the powers that be want to close the curtain quietly? We're entering a strange phase now, one where certainty dies and theory takes over, where whispers from 1888 turn into novels, into documentaries, into wildly creative YouTube videos featuring red string and grainy photos. And while that's happening, another question bubbles up, an uncomfortable one. What if the Ripper was never on anyone's list at all? Think about it. What if Jack wasn't an eccentric doctor, or an angry foreigner, or a deranged aristocrat? What if he was normal? What if he was a coach driver who knew every alley and watched the streets while others slept? Or a slaughterhouse assistant who was comfortable with blood, with knives, with silence? Or even just a quiet man who rented a room, paid his rent, and had no one looking too closely? We like our monsters theatrical. We want them to leave clues, to wear dark cloaks, to write in blood. But real horror? Real horror often doesn't announce itself. It walks quietly, buys a loaf of bread, nods politely to the landlady, and vanishes. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The last official report on the Ripper case was filed in 1892, 4 years after the murders began. In it, Chief Inspector Melville McNagton listed 3 suspects: Druitt, Kosminski, and a man named Michael Ostrog, a Russian thief and con artist. All 3 had problems. All three were possibilities. None had proof. Even McNaughton admitted the case was built on hunches and hindsight. He wrote, "No one ever saw the Whitechapel murderer. Many homicides have been ascribed to him. Probably, he had more than one personality." Cryptic? Sure. Helpful? Not especially. But it captures the chaos of it all, the unsolvableness. Jack didn't leave a neat bow. He left a knot. And everyone, police, journalists, historians, hobbyists, have been trying to untangle it ever since. Your quirky tidbit. In 1910, decades after the murders, one of the investigating officers, Robert Anderson, gave a speech saying he knew who the Ripper was all along, but couldn't prove it. He claimed a witness refused to testify because the suspect was of the same religion. Naturally, this sparked another century of arguments. Who was the suspect? Was it Kosminski? Was it someone else? Or was Anderson just trying to save face with a little well-placed mystery? We'll never know. That's the thing about Jack. He isn't just a historical figure. He's a canvas. Everyone paints their own theory on him, their own fear, their own story. In that way, he's still very much alive. Not in the shadows of Whitechapel, perhaps, but in the margins of every unsolved case. Every new killer the press names the next Ripper. Every profile, every cold case, binge watch. Because Jack the Ripper wasn't just a man who murdered 5 women in 1888. He became a blueprint for modern fear. A whisper with a knife. A mystery that refuses to sleep. Now the bodies have been buried. The blood's been scrubbed. The fog settled back into its usual haunts. But something still lingers in the alleyways of Whitechapel. A kind of tension. A kind of whisper. Because even though officially the murders are over, not everyone believes they really stopped. Welcome to the forgotten corridors of the case. Tonight, we wander into the margins, the blurry space beyond the canonical 5. That's what they're called, by the way. Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. The 5 victims generally agreed on by historians as Jack's definitive trail. But there were others. Maybe. And if Jack didn't stop in November of 1888, then the nightmare didn't end. It just changed shape. Let's begin with Martha Tabram. She was murdered before Polly Nichols on August 7th, 1888, stabbed 39 times in a stairwell. A different weapon, yes. No throat cutting. But the violence? Off the charts. Some early investigators believed she was Jack's first attempt, that he escalated after. Practicing, perhaps. Historians still argue whether Martha was his first victim or simply an unrelated tragedy. The ferocity fits. The method doesn't. Still, the timing is eerie. Then there's Alice Mackenzie. Killed in July 1889, almost a year after Mary Jane Kelly. Her throat was cut. Abdomen slashed, but not disemboweled. It was messier, less precise. Still, the similarities sparked suspicion. Was Jack back? Or was this a copycat? Or just Whitechapel being Whitechapel, a neighborhood where violence never really left? The official conclusion? Not the Ripper, but many disagree. Next up, the Pigeon Street torso. No joke, that's how it's cataloged in police files. Found in September 1889, a headless, limbless female torso, left under a railway arch. It wasn't the first. There had been others. The Thames Torso Murders, they were called. Beginning in 1887, ending in 1889. All dismembered women, all scattered through the city. Could it be the same killer? Some say no. Jack was precise, surgical. These were butcher jobs, but others argue that maybe he changed methods. Maybe the attention got too hot. Maybe he wanted to throw off the trail. Or maybe we're just seeing another killer altogether. London wasn't exactly lacking in violence. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Between 1887 and 1889, at least 6 women were murdered and dismembered in and around London in cases not officially linked to Jack the Ripper. Most of them remain unsolved. Which means that even if Jack stopped, London didn't. The city kept bleeding. And with every new body, people asked the same question. Is he back? That's the thing about a ghost. You can blame him for anything. There were even cases as late as 1901 that some tried to tie to the Ripper. Women found strangled, mutilated, abandoned. Most bore little resemblance to the original pattern, but the public was hungry for continuity. Because here's the truth. The story was more comfortable than the reality. The reality was this. Whitechapel was dangerous long before Jack. It stayed dangerous long after. Poverty, addiction, hunger, those things didn't retire in 1888. But Jack gave it shape. He turned the chaos into a character. Without him, the city's horror was random, senseless. With him, it had a face, even if that face was always hidden. Your quirky tidbit. In 1891, a woman named Frances Coles was murdered under a railway arch, throat cut, body fresh. A constable actually found her as she lay dying. The killer had been there moments earlier and vanished. Sound familiar? Police arrested a suspect, James Sadler, a sailor who'd been seen with Frances earlier. He was charged, questioned, hounded by the press. Eventually, released. Lack of evidence. The case faded, but Ripperologists never forgot it. Was Francis the Sixth? Maybe. But the further you get from 1888, the foggier it becomes. Records get thinner, names get confused, evidence goes missing, the chalk outlines blur. And yet, there's something poetic about this unsolved section of the case. Because it reflects exactly what the Ripper left behind. Fractured pieces, nothing whole, just clues without clarity. Violence without answer. Even the investigators themselves struggled with the extra victims. Some thought Jack only killed outdoors. Others said he only struck during certain phases of the moon. Some believed he had a type, older women, usually alone. Others said, he just killed whoever was easiest to kill. And that's the hardest pill to swallow. Because if you want to believe Jack had a pattern, a plan, a ritual, then you can comfort yourself with the idea that you'd never fit the mold. You wouldn't be his type. You'd be safe. But if he was just opportunistic, if he killed when the night was quiet and no one was watching, then anyone could be next. Which brings us to the uncomfortable theory that Jack didn't stop. He just got better at hiding. Maybe he moved to another country. Maybe he started targeting victims who weren't poor, weren't vulnerable, and thus got more attention and more resistance. Or maybe he learned the final lesson any serial killer learns, that killing isn't the only way to control. Sometimes fear is enough. A chalk message, a postcard, a letter that arrives without a return address. Those small things, they echoed longer than any knife ever could. And that echo, it still bounces through time, through newspaper archives, through dusty police files, through midnight podcasts, through rooms like this one, where you're lying in the dark, eyes half closed and wondering, was there a 6th, a 7th, a 100th? No one can say for sure. But the silence after 1888? It's not the silence of peace. It's the silence of a story that never really ended. The murders have stopped, or at least the ones people noticed. The headlines have cooled. The crowds have thinned. But inside Scotland Yard, gas lamps still burn late. files are still open. And in the detective offices where everything smells like pipe smoke and frustration, the case is far from over. Because while the city grieves and gossips, the police turn on each other. You'd think they'd be unified, right? A team working the biggest criminal case of the century? Coordinated? Focused? Motivated? Spoiler, they weren't. If anything, the case of Jack the Ripper exposed the deep cracks within Victorian law enforcement. And those cracks? They may have been just as responsible for the killer escaping as the fog and alleys ever were. Tonight, let's slip inside the corridors of power and watch the infighting unfold. At the heart of it all is Scotland Yard, specifically the Metropolitan Police, responsible for most of London. Leading them during the Ripper years was Commissioner Sir Charles Warren, a military man with a taste for order and a face that always looked like it just said, Then you've got the City of London Police, a smaller force in charge of a square-mile zone that included Mitre Square, where Catherine Eddowes was murdered. That one crime scene alone created a turf war. Because once Eddowes' body was found in the city's jurisdiction, the two forces were forced to work together. And by work together, I mean compete, like grumpy siblings fighting over the last slice of plum pudding. Each department had its own theories, its own suspects, and most damning, its own files, which they didn't always share. Investigations overlapped. Witnesses were questioned twice. Leads went cold because no one could agree whose job it was to follow up. Your mainstream historical fact: at the time of the Ripper murders, there was no centralized criminal database in the UK. Even fingerprints wouldn't become standard until the early 1900s. Each department kept its own records, usually handwritten, and often locked in filing cabinets labeled miscellaneous horrors. One particular clash became legendary: the Goulston Street graffito, that now infamous chalk message found above the piece of Catherine Eddowes' apron. We've talked about it before, but here's the twist. The city police wanted to photograph it. The Metropolitan Police, under Warren's orders, had it erased before daylight. Why? Warren believed the graffiti, blaming the Jews, could trigger an anti-Semitic riot. He ordered it wiped before anyone else could see it. Some say this destroyed potential direct evidence from the Ripper himself. Others believe it was already there, unconnected, and Warren did the right thing. Historians still argue whether Warren was a cautious protector or a man who panicked under pressure. Either way, the message, gone forever, became a symbol of everything the police mishandled. Here's your quirky tidbit. Warren was also an archaeologist. Yes, really. In fact, he was in charge of major excavations in Jerusalem before he became commissioner. Imagine digging up biblical ruins one year and chasing London's most infamous killer the next. That's a resume curveball if ever there was one. But Warren wasn't alone in the hot seat. Below him were a series of men trying to manage the chaos. Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, who became the lead on the case and kept private notes we still study today. Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson, who claimed they knew the Ripper's identity, but could never prove it in court. And Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline, the man on the ground closest to the action, described by his peers as methodical, fair, and 10 seconds from a nervous breakdown. These men didn't always agree. Anderson thought the Ripper was Kosminski. Swanson maybe agreed, but his notes are vague. Aberline? He leaned toward George Chapman, the poisoner. Said he had a peculiar look in his eyes. Very scientific. Each had their own pet suspect, and each thought the others were off the mark. Instead of building one case together, they chased separate ghosts. Even worse, the higher-ups were deeply worried about reputation. Scotland Yard had taken a beating in the press. Satirists showed detectives chasing their own shadows. Reporters mocked Warren's military demeanor. The public openly questioned the department's competence. So naturally, instead of full transparency, the Met began to pull back. They refused to issue a reward for information, fearing it would flood the station with false leads. They stopped sharing progress updates with the press. They shut down public access to reports. And in doing so, they created a perfect environment for rumors to grow. One of the strangest episodes? The case of Inspector Henry Moore, who was assigned to quietly investigate the investigators. A sort of internal affairs, Victorian style. His findings? Lost. Probably buried in a drawer somewhere labeled, "Things that make us look bad." You'd think a man hunting a serial killer would be working 24/7. But by early 1889, most of the senior detectives had returned to other cases: petty theft, fraud, burglaries. The Ripper investigation wasn't closed, but it had become cold. The kind of cold that settles in your bones and never really leaves. Your mainstream historical fact: the case remained open until 1892, 4 years after the last canonical murder. After that, it was quietly shelved, with only a handful of detectives still checking up on old suspects. And yet, behind the scenes, whispers continued. That the killer was known. That he was protected. That powerful people had buried the truth. Some said it was to avoid a scandal. Others believed it was simply to avoid embarrassment. Because nothing stings like being outwitted in your own backyard. By someone with a knife and a name he gave himself. So the police, bruised and bitter, stopped cooperating, not just with each other, but with the public. And that's when they lost. Because the moment the public stopped trusting the investigation, they stopped believing the killer could ever be caught. Which means Jack the Ripper didn't just kill 5 women. He killed the confidence of a city. He made people stop believing that justice would come. That justice could come. And in that silence, after the final case file was shelved, after the last memo was stamped unresolved, he got away with more than murder. He got away with the final word. Step lightly now. We're not walking through cobbled streets anymore. We're walking through secrets, rumors, theories that whisper like smoke. Because as the years passed and the files grew dusty, people stopped asking who Jack the Ripper was and started asking something much darker. Did someone already know? What if Jack wasn't caught? Not because he was clever or lucky, but because someone made sure he wouldn't be. Tonight, we enter the shadowy realm of cover-ups and conspiracies. This isn't about bodies anymore. It's about power. It starts, like many Victorian mysteries, in a gentleman's club. Over brandy, over whispers, over someone leaning in just a little too close to say, "You know, they say the Queen's nephew did it." Yes, we're back to royalty. Specifically, Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale. You've heard his name before. Queen Victoria's grandson, a man with a delicate constitution and a knack for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He wasn't particularly bright, wasn't particularly dangerous, but he was close to power. And that made him the perfect lightning rod for speculation. The theory? That Albert Victor had a secret marriage to a working-class woman named Annie Crook, that they had a child together, and that the royal family, horrified, covered it up. And who knew about this scandal? 5 women. Guess which 5? The story claims that Jack the Ripper wasn't one man, but a team. Royal agents, possibly Freemasons, eliminating witnesses to protect the monarchy. It sounds bonkers, but it's popular. One version says the murders were carried out by Sir William Gull, the Queen's personal physician, that he used his medical skills to mutilate the victims in ways that sent symbolic messages. Another claims the police were in on it, blocking the investigation, destroying evidence. threatening witnesses. And your mainstream historical fact: Freemasonry was deeply embedded in Victorian elite circles, including law enforcement. Many senior officers were members of the Brotherhood. And to conspiracy theorists, that's more than coincidence. That's infrastructure. Is it true? Almost certainly not. Prince Albert had airtight alibis for most of the murders. Some say he was hundreds of miles away. Others point out that his general health, delicate, tubercular, a little frail, didn't exactly scream eviscerator of doom. But again, it wasn't about truth. It was about comfort. Because if Jack was a prince, or a doctor, or a Freemason, then that explained why he vanished, why no one caught him, why the police failed. It wasn't incompetence. It was intent. Your quirky tidbit. In the 1970s, a British author named Stephen Knight popularized this theory in his book, Jack the Ripper: The Final Solution. It became a bestseller. It included maps, names, Freemason rituals, royal secrets, and enough plot twists to make Agatha Christie sit up in her grave. Historians, however, rolled their eyes so hard they nearly invented time travel. Still, the idea stuck. Hollywood picked it up. Comic books too. Alan Moore's From Hell turned it into a masterpiece of historical horror. And once you put a crown and a dagger in the same room, people don't forget. But this wasn't the only cover-up theory. Another claimed Jack was a respected surgeon, someone whose work was too valuable to expose. The story goes that a suspect confessed on his deathbed, but the police buried it to protect his reputation. Others said Jack was a foreign diplomat, and arresting him would have sparked an international scandal. And of course, there's the theory that Jack was a woman, a midwife, someone who could move freely through the streets, blood on her apron, and never draw suspicion. There was a brief panic in 1888 that a Jill the Ripper might be at large. It faded quickly, but it left a mark. Even inside the police, suspicion brewed. Some officers believed they'd found the killer, but that their reports were altered or hidden. One memo referenced a prime suspect who was let go due to interference. Another said evidence was confiscated before it could be reviewed. What does that mean? Nobody knows. Because those reports, gone, lost, burned, misplaced. Accidentally, of course. Probably. Your mainstream historical fact, Chief Inspector Swanson's private notes, discovered decades later, named Kosminski as the prime suspect, but no official report ever followed. The files were thin, the evidence vague, the trail cold. So either Swanson was right and someone blocked the case, or he was wrong and no one wanted to say it out loud. Here's the uncomfortable part. The more you look into the Ripper case, the less you know. The evidence is either missing, unverified, or outright suspicious. Timelines conflict. Names are spelled wrong. Witnesses contradict each other. And in that confusion, conspiracies grow. Because if nothing makes sense, everything starts to. Jack the Ripper becomes the perfect ghost, untouchable, unknowable, and infinitely flexible. He can be royal or poor, local or foreign, lone wolf or part of a network. Whatever the city fears most, Jack becomes it. And perhaps that's why he endured. Because he wasn't just a man. He was a mirror, held up to the empire at its height, and reflecting every crack beneath the gold leaf. And then, silence. It arrives not with a bang or a scream, but like fog curling beneath a closed door. There's no final victim, no farewell note, no grand finale. After Mary Jane Kelly's murder in November 1888, Jack the Ripper simply vanishes. The knives are sheathed. The newspapers wait for blood that never comes. Patrolmen walk their routes night after night, boots echoing on wet stone, but the shadows stay still. The killings just stop. Or do they? That's the mystery we unravel tonight. Why did Jack suddenly fall silent? It seems unnatural, doesn't it? 5 or maybe more horrific murders in rapid succession, each more gruesome than the last. And then, nothing. Like a fire burning furiously for weeks, and then one day stone cold. No embers, no smoke, just ashes and guesses. Let's walk through the theories. Theory 1, he died. Simple. Poetic, convenient. Many believe Jack may have succumbed to illness, suicide, or an unrelated act of violence. After all, Whitechapel was no picnic. Violent crime, disease, industrial accidents. It wasn't hard to disappear permanently in the East End. Montague John Druitt, the barrister found in the Thames? His suicide came weeks after Kelly's death. Some think it was the final act of a tortured killer. But no proof. Theory 2. He was institutionalized. Some believe Jack was sent to an asylum, locked away, silenced by padded walls and unasked questions. Aaron Kosminski is often cited here. His committal came shortly after the murder stopped. Coincidence or conclusion? He reportedly exhibited psychotic behavior, spoke of voices, refused to bathe or eat, and was paranoid about being fed through walls. But he lived for decades after, and his behavior didn't always fit what we'd expect from a methodical murderer. Still, historians lean on this theory hard. It explains the sudden stop, the silence. But like everything in this case, it's speculation dressed as evidence. Theory 3. He left. Jack could have hopped a ship, gone to the continent, started a new life, or a new killing spree, somewhere far from the fog. There were rumors of Ripper-like murders in New York, Paris, even South America. Some real, some tabloids trying to fan the flames. But none matched the precision or the theater of London's original nightmare. Still, with thousands of ships leaving the docks weekly, disappearing wasn't hard. Victorian passports, optional, identification, loose at best. A man could reinvent himself with a new name and clean clothes. And Jack seemed the reinventing type. Theory 4. He was never just one man. This one's a twist. Some theorists believe the Ripper murders were not the work of a single hand, but rather a series of disconnected killings, retroactively linked by the press and public. That the similarities, women killed in Whitechapel, throats cut, organs removed, were common enough in a violent city to be coincidence. That the story of Jack the Ripper was constructed, not uncovered. It's possible, but it's also deeply unsatisfying. Because the idea of one figure, one ghost lurking in the fog is far more compelling than a tangle of random tragedies. And that's what most agree on. Jack knew when to stop. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Serial killers do sometimes stop. Rarely, but it happens. Some are frightened by close calls. Others lose the compulsion. Some shift their behaviors or switch victims and go unnoticed. But Jack? He stopped at his peak. Mary Jane Kelly's death was the most gruesome, the most intimate, the one that took the most time. It feels like a crescendo, a final performance. Which brings us to theater theory. What if Jack saw the whole thing as a performance? An act. A campaign to terrorize. A narrative. A public myth being carved in real time. And when he was finished, the curtain fell. He vanished not because he was afraid, but because he was done. Some researchers point to the letters, the taunts, the names, the boasts. Jack wasn't just killing. He was crafting a legend. A legend doesn't need to be caught. A legend doesn't need an ending. It needs to linger. Your quirky tidbit. In the early 1900s, A former constable claimed Jack the Ripper had been a well-known East End landlord who died in 1891. He said the police knew, but kept it quiet to prevent panic. His story was never verified, but it sparked a local pub to name a beer after the suspect. It sold out within a week. Victorians, man. There's also the idea that Jack became something else. Not literally, but symbolically. He stopped killing, but he didn't stop existing. His image spread across oceans, across generations. His silhouette, his calling card, his legend became part of popular culture. Newspapers still printed Ripper speculation years later. Children played games about him in the street. Crime fiction writers turned his story into novels, then films. And in that way, Jack never stopped. He just evolved. Which is perhaps the most haunting idea of all. That the real goal wasn't 5 deaths. It was immortality. Your mainstream historical fact. As early as 1895, Jack the Ripper became a character in stage plays. Later, he'd appear in silent films, comic books, and even video games. Few real murderers have been so thoroughly absorbed into entertainment. And why? Because he left us with a riddle that feels just solvable enough to keep chasing. 5 women, 5 nights, a city in chaos. And then, nothing. No body, no trial, no confession. Just fog. So maybe Jack didn't vanish. Maybe he just became a story. And stories, as we know, don't die. They wait. By now, the murders are history. The files are fading. Detectives have retired, moved on, or died, still wondering what clue they missed. But as the fog lifts and the facts grow faint, something unexpected happens. The victims fade faster than the killer. And that may be the greatest tragedy of all. Because somewhere in the sea of suspects, postcards, press clippings, and wild-eyed theories, we stopped asking the simplest question. Who were they? Not as bodies, as people. So tonight, we step back, not to Jack, but to them, the women, and the truth about how 5 human beings became 5 case files. You've heard their names already. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. History calls them the canonical 5, like they were a literary unit, a neat package. But there was nothing neat about their lives, nothing uniform, and they weren't born to be remembered like this. Start with Mary Ann Nichols, Polly. Born in 1845, the daughter of a locksmith. She married young, had 5 children. Then her marriage collapsed. Alcohol, arguments, poverty. She drifted between workhouses and doss houses, lived in women's shelters. She still wrote to her father. When she died, she was wearing a bonnet and 5 layers of tattered skirts. That was all she had. She was 43. Then there's Annie Chapman. She once had a good life. Married to a coachman, 3 children, 1 with a disability. But drink crept in. The marriage fractured. After separation, Annie took to the streets. She sold crochet, matches, anything she could. Wore a wedding ring, though her husband was long gone. She was last seen trying to earn enough for a bed. Her throat was cut, and her intestines were arranged beside her, like a cruel display. She was 47. Elizabeth Stride, Liz, was a Swedish immigrant. She spoke with an accent, claimed once to have survived a shipwreck, though no records confirm it. She lived at a Salvation Army shelter for a time. Was known for cleaning her boots obsessively. She worked odd jobs, cleaned rooms, took in laundry. On the night she died, she'd just eaten grapes given to her by a client. She was 45. Then comes Catherine Eddowes. She was sharp, talkative, a known storyteller. Once got arrested for impersonating a fire survivor just to earn coins. She was proud of her singing voice, had lived with a man named Thomas Conway for years, though they'd separated. On the night of her murder, she had just been released from jail for drunkenness. She thanked the officer, joked with him, and walked off into the dark. Within an hour, she was dead. She was 46. And finally, Mary Jane Kelly. She's the mystery. Younger than the rest, 25. Irish, maybe, or Welsh. She told different stories to different people. Claimed to have once lived in a Parisian brothel. May have been trafficked, or lied about it. May have had a son, or not. She lived in Miller's Court, a single damp room. Friends remembered her singing late into the night before she died. A mournful ballad, a violet from Mother's grave. She was murdered indoors, brutally, left unrecognizable. And yet in life, she was said to be kind, gentle, a soft voice in a hard world. They called her Fair Emma. She was buried in a pauper's grave. All 5 women were. Let that sink in. All 5 of these women lived on the edge, between hunger and shelter, survival and invisibility. But they weren't just statistics. They were mothers, wives, daughters. Some had children they rarely saw but never stopped writing to. Some had illnesses, trauma, joy. One loved singing. One loved cleaning. One wore a ring for a man who no longer wore one for her. They were all more than what happened to them. And yet, for over a century, the world remembered their deaths more than their lives. Even today, most RIPPER tours start at crime scenes. Very few start with their stories. Your mainstream historical fact. It wasn't until 2018, 130 years later, that a memorial was unveiled in London to honor the RIPPER's victims by name. That long. It reads, "In memory of the women murdered in Whitechapel in or near this place in 1888." And it lists their names. No mention of Jack. Just them. Here's your quirky tidbit. A group of historians once published a book titled The Five, entirely focused on reclaiming the stories of the women, not the man who killed them. It became a bestseller, not because of the gore, but because people finally wanted to know the truth about the lives Jack stole, not just the crime scenes he left. There's a lesson in that. In our fascination with monsters, we sometimes forget the people they destroy. We turn tragedy into puzzles, murders into myths. But the cost? Real. The women who died in Whitechapel didn't ask to be legends. They asked for a warm bed, a quiet meal, a second chance. Some asked for nothing at all. And the saddest truth, they may have only become visible because they died. But tonight, in this quiet space between the noise of history and the hush of sleep, we remember them differently. Not as bodies on cobblestone, not as entries in a file, but as people. And maybe that's the beginning of something better. Me. By now, the case has drifted from memory to mythology. But the urge to solve it, to crack the greatest mystery in criminal history, never fades. The 20th century arrives, and with it, new hope, modern science, new tools, fresh eyes. Maybe, just maybe, we can finally catch a man who's been dead for decades. Tonight, we walk the thin line between truth and technology and ask, can modern forensics unmask Jack the Ripper? Let's rewind to 1988. It's the centennial of the murders. 100 years. Documentaries flood the airwaves. Bookstores overflow with fresh Ripper theories, each louder than the last. And just as the hype threatens to outpace the facts, a shawl appears, supposedly found near the body of Catherine Eddowes, preserved, folded, kept in a box by a policeman's descendant. It becomes an artifact, a relic, a legend in cotton and bloodstain. And decades later, in 2014, it becomes evidence. A team runs DNA analysis on the shawl, mitochondrial DNA specifically, traced through maternal lines. The result? A match with descendants of Aaron Kosminski. Suddenly, headlines scream, "Jack the Ripper identified." But not so fast. Your mainstream historical fact: mitochondrial DNA only proves maternal similarity, not individual identity. It's like saying someone in your grandmother's family ate the last slice of cake. Helpful, but not exactly case closed. There's more. Experts raise questions about chain of custody. The shawl was handled by dozens, hundreds of people over a century. It was stored improperly, possibly contaminated. Some even doubt it ever came from the crime scene at all. Still, the theory lingers. Kosminski remains high on the suspect list, and forensic optimism endures. Here's your quirky tidbit. Another group once claimed they'd found Jack's diary, a handwritten confession supposedly from a Liverpool cotton merchant named James Maybrick. The diary described the murders in gruesome detail, but critics quickly spotted anachronisms, weird grammar, and convenient flourishes. Most believe it was a clever forgery, possibly from the 1990s. Still, it's been published in several editions, because Ripper content sells, even fake Ripper content. As forensic tech improved, fingerprints, blood typing, and eventually DNA profiling, investigators re-examined every shred of evidence. Old case files, autopsy notes, photographs, letters. But there's a problem. The evidence is too old. Most of it was never preserved properly. No one in 1888 thought to save samples for the invention of CSI. There were no sealed plastic bags, no crime scene tape, just constables and chalk. Take the "From Hell" letter, the one sent with the kidney. It was never fingerprinted, never sealed, touched by countless hands. By the time modern science arrived, the clues had evaporated. Some turned to handwriting analysis. They compared the letters signed Jack the Ripper to those of various suspects. Results? Inconclusive. Too many variables. And most of the evidence is circumstantial at best. One analyst said, "It's like trying to match a ghost's footprint to a drawing of a boot." Still, the forensic efforts continue. Some researchers tried to digitally reconstruct facial composites of suspects. Others mapped the murder sites using geographic profiling, attempting to triangulate where the killer might have lived. The result? Likely somewhere near Flower and Dean Street. Which, honestly, we already knew. That was the heart of Whitechapel's darkest corners, a place so rough even the rats held pocket watches. But the science gave it shape, gave it structure. And that's something. Because even if Jack himself remains a mystery, the study of criminal behavior grew because of him. Modern profiling, crime scene preservation, witness interviewing techniques, all of it was influenced, in part, by the failures of the Ripper case. Jack became a case study in what not to do. And in that way, he taught us more than he took. Your mainstream historical fact, Scotland Yard's early murder books, which later became templates for modern police files, were developed during and after the Ripper case. The mess left behind forced them to organize better, standardize reports, and create a more structured approach to homicides. Let's not forget, Jack was the first media serial killer. His crimes weren't just brutal. They were branded, publicized, sold. The term serial killer wasn't coined until the 1970s. But the pattern, the ritual, the urge, it all began here, in the alleys of Whitechapel. So modern criminal psychology often begins its syllabus with Jack. He's not just a case. He's the blueprint. And in that blueprint, we find both progress and grief. Progress because we learned how to hunt monsters. Grief because we never caught this one. And the deeper we dig into the case with DNA tests and handwriting scans, the more we realize something strange. Jack wasn't just a man with a knife. He was a man with a head start. A century-long one. Every scientific advance has to work backward. Every theory depends on evidence that no longer exists. It's like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces burned, some replaced by gossip, and others drawn in crayon by your Uncle Fred. And yet, we keep trying, because some mysteries feel like they should be solvable. Jack walked real streets, spoke real words, breathed the same smog as everyone else. He wasn't a ghost. And that's what makes the silence so loud. He was flesh and blood. And now, just data points. Scattered. Faint. Waiting. Yeah. Let's take a breath. We've traveled through blood-stained alleys, conspiracy-riddled archives, and dust-choked police files. But even now, after every theory and every test, the most haunting truth still lingers. We don't really want to solve it. Not completely. Because if we did, if someone suddenly unveiled a crisp, clear photo and said, "This is Jack the Ripper, and here's what he did and why," the story would end. And people don't like endings when the mystery has become part of the myth. Tonight, we explore how Jack the Ripper transformed from killer to cultural icon. Sounds strange, doesn't it? To say icon about a man who butchered 5 women. But history's strange like that. It doesn't just remember, it rewrites. Let's start with the tourism. Today, you can walk the Ripper Trail in London. Guided night tours with flickering lanterns, faux fog, and eager narrators who point to the cobblestones where Polly Nichols died. You can visit gift shops near Whitechapel Station that sell Ripper-themed mugs, t-shirts, snow globes. Snow globes. The man may have been a ghost, but he's also somehow a brand. And that's the real mystery now. Why him? Why Jack? There have been deadlier killers, grislier crimes, yet none endure quite like this one. It starts with timing. Jack arrived during a media revolution. Newspapers were cheaper, more sensational. The public appetite for horror was skyrocketing, and here comes a killer who doesn't just murder, he performs, leaves clues, sends letters, names himself. He was the perfect anti-hero for a Victorian age simmering with anxiety. Poverty was rising, gender roles were cracking, immigration stirred xenophobic fears. London felt like it was changing faster than anyone could control. And Jack? He became the scapegoat of everything going wrong. He targeted women, specifically women who were poor, vulnerable, undesirable in the eyes of the press. In doing so, he activated every moral panic of the era. And moral panics, they sell. Your mainstream historical fact. After the Ripper murders, sales of the Illustrated Police News, a sensationalist crime paper, tripled. Readers couldn't get enough. Images of the victims, often inaccurate, were drawn in lurid detail. Every headline ended with exclamation points. Jack didn't just kill people. He gave rise to a media genre. And that genre hasn't stopped. There are over 200 books dedicated solely to identifying Jack the Ripper. Dozens more explore the crimes, the victims, the social context. He's appeared in radio plays, comic books, manga, graphic novels, and at least 20 films, from silent cinema to modern thrillers. He's battled Sherlock Holmes, stalked through Batman's Gotham, and even popped up on Doctor Who. Quirky tidbit. In 1979, a sci-fi film called Time After Time imagined Jack the Ripper stealing H.G. Wells' time machine and traveling to modern-day San Francisco. Wells follows him to stop the killings, which have resumed, only now with disco and polyester suits. It's delightfully bonkers, but it proves a point. Jack transcended his own century. He became portable. You can drop him into any time, any story, any city, and he still makes sense, still evokes fear. Because he's not just a killer, he's a symbol. And symbols, they survive. Even the academic world has embraced the Ripper. Entire university courses explore the Ripper phenomenon as a case study in gender, media, criminology, and class struggle. They debate not just who he was, but why we care so much. And the answer. Because Jack the Ripper is a safe kind of danger. He's long dead. We know the setting, the fog, the gas lamps, the horse hooves on stone. We know he's out there, but not here. And that gives us permission to be curious, to investigate, to even enjoy the mystery. It's the same reason ghost stories comfort more than terrify. They carry us to a time that feels dangerous, but distant. And Jack? He's our Victorian ghost. Except this one didn't die in a fire or fall down a well. This one carved a path through a real city and then vanished. And because he vanished, we fill in the blanks. Was he tall, limping, left-handed, charming? Every storyteller picks a version. Every theory paints a new mask. He's a choose-your-own monster. And the industry built around him? Massive. There are conventions like RIPPERCon, where researchers present new findings and sell memorabilia. There are escape rooms, murder mystery dinners, virtual tours, YouTube channels, podcasts, even Ripper-themed pub quizzes. The man has a Pinterest board. And yet, no one can tell you his real name. That's the paradox. Jack the Ripper is both overexposed and unknown. Every detail has been argued, every corner of Mitre Square dissected. And still, we don't know. And maybe deep down, we like it that way. Because Jack's not just a story we tell. He's a story we keep retelling. He lets us play detective without the danger. He lets us peer into the abyss without falling in. He lets us say, how could this happen? When what we really mean is, thank God it didn't happen to me. Yeah. We've come a long way. Through alleys and autopsies, panic and poetry, whispers and wild-eyed theories. And now, here we are, peering over the edge of the past, one last time, asking the question that hangs above all the others like a gas lamp in fog. Why does Jack still haunt us? Not just the case, not just the mystery, but the feeling? That quiet unease, that unnamed shadow at the corner of your mind when you walk alone at night and realize the street's too quiet, too empty, too familiar. Jack the Ripper isn't just a name in a file anymore. He's an archetype. He stands in for every mystery we haven't solved, every injustice that got away, every crime that didn't come with a neat little ending. But he's also more than that. He's a reminder of what happens when the world stops seeing certain people, when poverty becomes background noise, when the vulnerable aren't protected, when women's lives are reduced to footnotes and their deaths become sensational headlines. Let's linger on that. Because while Jack vanished into legend, the world that created him didn't. The same systems, the same fears, the same blind spots, they're all still here. Maybe dressed differently, maybe digitized, but present. Your mainstream historical fact. In 1888, over 900 women were registered as living in Whitechapel workhouses and shelters. Many were single, unemployed, or sick. The Ripper's victims weren't chosen randomly. They were chosen from a population the city had already forgotten. That's what made them vulnerable. That's what made them invisible. And that's why the story endures. Because deep down, we know this wasn't just about one man and one knife. It was about a society stretched to its limits, a city bursting at the seams, a system that couldn't, or wouldn't, protect its most desperate. And into that vacuum, Jack stepped. Here's your quirky tidbit. In 2006, London authorities tried to install a Jack the Ripper museum. Locals were told it would focus on women's history in the East End. When it opened, it was basically a wax horror house of blood and butchery. Public outcry was swift. Protesters graffitied the windows with the victims' names. Eventually, the museum changed course, but the damage was done. Because even now, the story is a tug of war between tragedy and entertainment, between justice and spectacle, between remembering who died and glorifying who killed. That's the danger. The longer a case stays unsolved, the more people try to own it, to tell it their way, to reshape it into something cleaner, more fun, less uncomfortable. But this story? It's not supposed to be clean. It's not supposed to be easy. It's supposed to feel like this, foggy, cold, echoing. Because in the end, Jack isn't just a figure from 1888. He's a question. Not who was he, but what happens when we stop caring for the people no one wants to look at? What happens when a city treats human lives as disposable? What happens when fear becomes familiar and justice optional? Those are the real mysteries. And they're not locked in the past. They're alive, unsolved, ongoing. Because long after the knives were sheathed and the crowds went home, Jack left us with more than terror. He left us with a riddle, one we keep asking, not to catch him, but to understand ourselves. You want to know why Jack the Ripper was never caught? Maybe it's not because he vanished. Maybe it's because we weren't ready to see him in the first place. Not in the alley. Not in the mirror. Not in the systems we built and ignored. Maybe, just maybe, we were looking in all the wrong places. Yeah. The gas lamps flicker lower now. The streets grow quiet. We've reached the last corner, the final cobblestone. 130-some years later, Jack the Ripper remains the ghost we built a city around, a shadow without a face, still haunting the edges of Whitechapel's history. But to truly understand why he was never caught, we need to look not just at him, but at everything that let him happen. This was never just one mystery. It was a perfect storm. Start with the setting. Victorian London wasn't a postcard. It was a heaving, roaring monster of a city, booming with wealth on one side and sinking in filth on the other. Whitechapel was where the empire buried its guilt, overcrowded, underfed, and overlooked. In a place where people died quietly every night, 5 loud deaths didn't seem so outrageous at first. Then came the police. Good intentions, but overwhelmed, undertrained, divided by turf wars and bureaucracy. No forensics, no profiling, no reliable way to collect evidence. Some officers couldn't even read, and they weren't hunting just a criminal. They were hunting something new. A predator that killed for no clear reason, not for money, not for revenge, just for the act. That alone paralyzed them. And then the press. The papers turned Jack into a monster celebrity. Letters were printed. Maps were drawn. Tours were launched while the case was still open. The public didn't just follow the investigation. They fueled it. And every new theory made things worse. He became a surgeon, a prince, a butcher, a woman, a ghost, a metaphor. a reflection of London's deepest shame. And somewhere in all that noise, the real man slipped away. Maybe he died. Maybe he was locked up. Maybe he left. Or maybe he just looked too normal to suspect. Historians still argue whether the police ever truly had a chance, or whether the case was doomed from the start. Because solving a murder is hard. Solving 5 disconnected ones with almost no evidence under national scrutiny in a city already burning with tension. Nearly impossible. And now, with every passing year, we drift further from the truth. Jack the Ripper has become too many things to be just one. He's a crime scene, a conspiracy, a cautionary tale, a tourist attraction. He's the reason people still fear narrow alleys and late footsteps. He's the reason we say, what if, more than what now. But perhaps most haunting of all, he's become the benchmark for horror. Every serial killer since has been compared to him. And that comparison has often told us more about us than about him. Our fears, our fascinations, our blind spots. Because Jack didn't just escape capture, he escaped definition. And the people he killed. They're still climbing out from under his shadow. Still being remembered finally, not for how they died, but for how they lived. Which in the end might be the only justice this story ever gets. Because the real answer to why was Jack the Ripper never caught isn't just about suspects and alibis. It's about the world that allowed him to exist. A world that didn't see women like Polly, or Annie, or Catherine until it was too late. A world that didn't prepare its officers to face the unknown. A world that turned murder into myth so fast, the truth got buried under the headlines. And that world still echoes in ours. So maybe tonight, before the last lamp goes out, we stop asking about Jack and start asking about everyone else. The people who were forgotten, the lives that mattered. Because history isn't just about catching monsters. It's about making sure the next one doesn't find it so easy to hide. The fog has lifted, the footsteps have faded, and the night has done what nights do best, softened the hard edges of the past until they feel more like stories than scars. You've walked the winding alleys of Whitechapel tonight, listened to whispers echo off brick, watched lanterns sway in the dark. You followed a case that has confounded experts, obsessed hobbyists, and haunted cities for over a century. And now, it's time to let it go. Let the theories quiet. Let the suspects return to shadow. Let the mystery be what it always was, a question without an answer, and maybe, mercifully, without a need for one. Because sometimes the point of the story is not to solve it, but to sit beside it, to remember, to wonder, to feel the chill of history brushing past your sleeve, gentle and strange. And in that quiet, ask yourself, what else have we missed? Whose stories haven't we heard? Who still waits to be seen, not as a name in a file, but as someone who laughed, cried, danced, and hoped, even if just once? Let your thoughts drift there. Let your breath slow. The street is empty now. The last of the smoke has curled away into the night. And whatever Jack was, whoever he was, he can't touch you here. You're safe. You're warm. You're still. And the city, like your mind, can rest for now. We'll pick up the lantern another night. But for now, just sleep. If you've made it all the way to the end, leave a comment and tell me what story you'd like to hear next. I genuinely enjoy seeing and reading every kind word you share. Thank you for watching. Sweet dreams and good night.